I still remember the sound of rolling suitcases and the echo of flight announcements bouncing off the tall ceilings when it happened. My mother's hand slipped out of mine, and for a second I thought she was just adjusting her bag. But then, she walked faster, her back straight, her heels clicking against the airport tiles. I was 8 years old, clutching a faded backpack with a stuffed rabbit inside, watching the only person I trusted disappear into the crowd without looking back. 5 minutes later, I realized she wasn't coming back, and my life split in two. The part before that day and everything after. I sat down on the cold metal bench near gate 23, my legs too short to touch the floor, and tried to convince myself it was a mistake. She had to be coming back. Maybe she went to the bathroom. Maybe she was checking on something at the counter. I repeated those excuses in my head until the announcements turned from English to other languages I didn't understand, and the seats around me emptied. My backpack felt heavier by the minute, like it carried the truth I didn't want to face. I opened it. Inside was a half-empty juice box, a sandwich wrapped in foil, and that rabbit. No ticket, no note, no money, nothing. When the airport lights dimmed and the staff started sweeping the terminal, one of the security guards finally asked me where my parents were. I opened my mouth to answer, but no sound came out, because I realized for the first time in my life, I didn't have anyone left. They took me to a small office near the check-in counters, where the walls smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. A woman in a navy blazer crouched down to meet my eyes, speaking gently, asking if I knew my mom's phone number. I gave it to her, clinging to the hope that she would pick up and laugh, explain this was all a misunderstanding. But when the woman dialed, I could hear the ringing stretch into silence before going dead. They tried again, and the answer was the same. The hours blurred after that. Someone brought me a blanket. Someone else offered me crackers I couldn't swallow, and a man filled out forms with my name and age, his pen scratching angrily against the paper. I kept looking at the sliding doors, expecting her to walk back through them with that annoyed expression she always wore, scolding me for causing a scene. But midnight came, the airport grew quiet, and it wasn't her who arrived. It was child services. They drove me away in a van with windows that wouldn't open, the stuffed rabbit pressed against my chest. That night I lay in a strange bed, staring at a ceiling I didn't recognize, and I understood something children aren't supposed to understand. When your own mother leaves you in an airport with nothing but a backpack, she isn't planning on coming back. The foster home was nothing like what I had imagined when people used to talk about a safe place for kids. It was an old brick building with peeling paint and too many doors that locked from the outside. The woman who ran it, Mrs. Henderson, had a tight bun and sharper eyes than anyone I'd ever met, and she never smiled unless someone important was visiting. There were 6 other kids, all older than me, who had already learned how to survive, by stealing extra food or hiding their shoes so no one else could take them. I was small, quiet, and easy to overlook, which was both a blessing and a curse. At school, I told no one what had happened. I just said my mom was away and left it at that, because explaining the truth felt like reopening a wound I couldn't close. But at night, when the house creaked and someone cried in the next room, I would lie awake and replay that moment in the airport. Her walking away, the sound of her heels fading, my own small voice never leaving my throat. The years crawled forward, marked by birthdays with sheet cakes bought on clearance and gifts donated by charities. I learned to pack light, to never expect anyone to stay, and to keep my backpack close at all times because it was the only constant in my life. When I turned 15, I realized I had carried that same rabbit for 7 years, its fur matted and ears bent, and I wondered if my mother would even recognize me if she saw me now. The thought burned so deep it pushed me to make a promise in silence. If I ever saw her again, I wouldn't be the lost little girl waiting on a bench. I would be someone she could never abandon twice. By the time I turned 18, I had learned how to disappear in plain sight. I kept my head down, worked double shifts at a diner, and saved every dollar like it was oxygen. College wasn't an option, not without someone to co-sign loans or help me navigate paperwork, but I managed to get a small apartment with peeling wallpaper and a mattress on the floor. It was mine, and that mattered more than the cracks in the walls. I still had the rabbit, tucked in the top of my closet like a relic of another life, but I never touched it anymore. Instead, I built routines: coffee before sunrise, bus rides with strangers, counting tips in the dark until my hands smelled of grease and soap. I thought I had buried the past so deep it couldn't touch me, but one evening, while clearing tables, I saw her. My mother. Older, hair streaked with gray, wearing a tailored coat that didn't belong to someone struggling. She was sitting at a booth with a man laughing softly, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. She hadn't disappeared off the face of the earth. She had simply disappeared from me. I stood frozen, holding a tray, until her eyes brushed past mine without recognition, like I was just another waitress in her way. The world tilted then, and I realized something harsher than the night at the airport. She hadn't abandoned everyone. She had only abandoned me. I dropped the tray so hard that the glasses shattered across the floor, but she didn't even flinch. The man she was with glanced up, annoyed, while she kept her gaze firmly on her menu, as if I were invisible. My manager rushed over, apologizing to them, and ordered me to clean up the mess. I knelt on the tiles with a rag, my hands shaking, the sound of her laughter cutting through me like broken glass. After they finished their meal, she left cash on the table, more than the bill cost, and walked out without a glance in my direction. I picked up the bills and stared at them, my throat tightening. It wasn't generosity. It was dismissal. The same way she had dismissed me at 8 years old. That night, I went back to my apartment and pulled out the rabbit from the closet. For the first time in years, I held it tight and I cried. Not because I wanted her back, but because I finally understood she never would be. By morning, the tears had hardened into something sharper. I started digging. Through public records, through whispers from old neighbors, through scraps of information I pieced together like shards of a puzzle. She had remarried. She had children. 2 boys, both in private schools, both with everything I had been denied. And she lived less than 30 minutes from me the entire time. The betrayal deepened into something I couldn't ignore. She hadn't been gone. She had been living a brand new life right over the horizon, one that had no room for me. And I knew then, whether she remembered me or not, I was going to make sure she never forgot what she had done. I started by showing up in places she wouldn't expect me. At the grocery store near her neighborhood, I timed my visits so we'd cross paths in the aisles. The first time she looked at me briefly, then turned away, pretending not to recognize me. But I saw her grip on the shopping cart tighten, her knuckles white, and I knew she remembered. I didn't say a word, just let her walk away with that panic flickering behind her eyes. Then I left a note in her mailbox. No name, no signature, just a line written in my neatest handwriting. Airports are loud, but silence is louder. A week later, I heard she had switched her kids' school pickup routine, sending her husband instead of going herself. I let her paranoia grow. Every few days, I'd leave something small where she could find it. A stuffed rabbit in the trunk of her car, a juice box on her porch, a sandwich in foil left on the hood of her SUV. I never confronted her directly, because I wanted her to feel what I had felt at 8 years old. Abandoned, unsafe, unsure when or where it would happen next. She had chosen to erase me, to pretend I didn't exist, but I was done being erased. I wanted her to wake up every morning and wonder if today would be the day I finally spoke, or if I would let her drown in the silence she once forced on me. Her husband was the one who finally broke the pattern. One evening, as I stood across the street watching their lights flicker on in the living room, he came out and confronted me. He wasn't angry at first, he was confused. He asked if I was lost, if I needed help, if I was waiting for someone. And I could tell from the way he spoke that he didn't know who I was, that she had never mentioned me, not even as a shadow from her past. That realization hurt more than anything. She had erased me so completely that the man she shared her life with didn't even know I existed. I wanted to scream, to shatter the illusion she had built, but instead I smiled faintly and told him I was fine, just passing through. He accepted that answer too easily, went back inside, and I stood there staring at the window as she pulled the curtain shut like a final barrier between us. That was when I knew silence alone wasn't enough. If she had the power to erase me, then I had the power to write myself back into her story, no matter how much she tried to hide me. I started collecting proof, not of her abandonment because that was my wound alone, but of the life she was living now. Photos of her with her new children at school events, her polished image at charity galas, the perfect house she pretended was built on love instead of betrayal. I kept it all in a folder, thickening it day by day, until it felt heavier than the backpack she had left me with. And then I started to make it known. I didn't attack her directly. I slipped pieces of the past into her carefully crafted present. At a fundraiser where she gave a speech, I left a photo of me at 8 years old on her podium, the airport ceiling lights reflected in my wide, terrified eyes. At her son's soccer game, she found the rabbit propped up against the bleachers, its fur dirtier and more worn than before. At first, she tried to dismiss it, to convince herself it was coincidence, but I saw the cracks forming. She grew restless, her smile slipping in public, her hands fidgeting with jewelry she used to wear so confidently. She was starting to feel what I had lived with for years, that gnawing fear that nothing was secure, that the ground beneath you could vanish at any moment. And still, I didn't confront her. I wanted her to unravel piece by piece, to see her perfect world rot from the inside. I wanted her to wake up every morning and wonder if today was the day the truth would catch her. Because I knew the truth didn't need to scream to destroy someone. Sometimes the quietest reminders, the smallest echoes of what you've done, are what tear you apart most completely. And every time I saw her glance over her shoulder, every time her voice wavered when she spoke in public, I knew my silence had become louder than any words I could ever speak. The night everything came to a breaking point wasn't planned. It unfolded the way storms do, inevitable after years of pressure. She was hosting a charity dinner at a downtown hotel, the kind with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. I slipped in easily. No one questions a young woman in a black dress carrying a clipboard. The guests were sipping champagne, laughter ringing in the air, and she stood near the stage, poised and graceful like the world had never touched her. But I saw the flicker in her eyes the moment she spotted me across the room. For a split second, her smile faltered, and the Ache mask nearly fell. I didn't rush her. I just walked closer, slow enough to let her panic bloom. When I reached the table she was standing beside, I placed a manila envelope on the white tablecloth. Inside were the pieces of proof I had collected. The photos, the copies of records, even a copy of the police report from the airport the night she abandoned me. She didn't dare open it in front of everyone, but I saw her hand tremble as she slid it under her clutch. She leaned in slightly, her voice a whisper so soft only I could hear, "What do you want?" For years I had imagined that moment. How I'd scream at her, demand answers, force her to admit what she'd done. But standing there, looking at her, I realized I didn't need her words anymore. She could lie, deny, spin excuses, but none of it mattered. What I wanted wasn't an apology. What I wanted was for her to feel the weight of everything she had tried to bury, to know that no matter how high she climbed, her foundation was cracked. So I leaned close, steady and calm, and said the only truth that mattered. "I want you to remember." Then I walked away, leaving her surrounded by glittering chandeliers and smiling faces, with an envelope that weighed more than all the diamonds around her neck. In the weeks that followed, I didn't need to push further. The whispers started on their own. She became distracted, forgetful, snapping at people she once charmed effortlessly. Her husband began to notice. Her children overheard arguments, and the perfect image she had polished for decades started to dull. I didn't expose her publicly. I didn't destroy her with headlines or accusations. I let her destroy herself, with the fear that at any moment someone else might open an envelope, someone else might find out what she had done. That was the revenge I had carried since I was 8 years old. Not fire and chaos, but the same gnawing uncertainty she had forced on me. She had left me in an airport with a backpack and silence. Now I had left her in her own world with nothing but the echo of what she'd done, and the knowledge that silence would follow her too, wherever she went. She tried to fight back in, the only way she knew how, by pretending harder. She doubled down on her charities, plastered her face on social media with carefully staged photos of smiling family dinners and holiday mornings around the tree. But I could see through every pixel, and so could the people closest to her. Her husband approached me again, this time outside the grocery store where we had first crossed paths. His tone wasn't soft anymore. He demanded to know who I was, why I was following his wife, what I was trying to get from them. I looked him straight in the eyes and said the words she had never given him. "I'm her daughter." For a moment his face went blank, like the ground had just given way beneath him. He tried to laugh, to call me delusional, but the way his voice cracked betrayed him. He knew deep down I wasn't lying. He stormed off, phone already in hand, and that was the beginning of the unraveling. Days later, I got a call from a blocked number. It was her. Her voice was colder than I remembered, but weaker too. She said, "You've had your fun. Stop this. You'll ruin everything." And that was the moment I realized she still didn't understand. She thought this was about fun, about revenge as a game, about me wanting to destroy her life. She couldn't see that she had already destroyed mine years ago, and I was just handing her the mirror. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply told her, "You already ruined everything the day you left me." Then I hung up. I let her sit with that truth. No explanations, no bargaining. The weeks turned into months, and word spread in ways I hadn't even planned. Her husband filed for separation. Her sons asked questions she couldn't answer. Her charities started quietly distancing themselves after rumors reached donors. And every time she tried to silence the storm, it only grew louder, because the people closest to her finally realized she wasn't who she pretended to be. I didn't need to show them the evidence anymore. The cracks were already visible. She had abandoned me once in an airport, but now it was her turn to be left behind, standing alone in a world that no longer believed in her perfect smile. And, this time, there would be no one waiting on the bench when she turned around. The last time I saw her was nothing like the glittering dinners or carefully staged photos. It was in a courthouse hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing above us, the smell of stale paper and cheap coffee hanging in the air. She looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders hunched, makeup uneven, her hands clutching a folder so tight, the edges bent. She had been subpoenaed in her divorce proceedings, and part of the documentation her husband's lawyers dug up included the very envelope I had left her. She couldn't hide me anymore. My name was on record, the police report, the abandoned child she had erased. I didn't have to say a word. The system spoke for me. As she walked past, her eyes caught mine, and for the first time I saw fear, without denial. Not because she thought I'd shout or cause a scene, but because she knew there was no pretending left to do. She whispered, barely audible, "Why are you doing this?" And I finally answered the question she should have asked me 20 years ago. "Because you already did." After that, I left the courthouse and walked into the daylight. The city sounds loud and alive around me. For years, I had carried the weight of being the abandoned child, the invisible daughter who waited at a gate that never opened. But now I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hiding behind silence or haunting her shadows. I had shown her that what she left behind didn't stay buried, that the little girl with the backpack had grown into a woman who refused to be erased. And for the first time, the memory of that airport didn't paralyze me. It sharpened me. I realized that revenge wasn't about screaming or burning her world down. It was about making her feel the same emptiness she gave me, the same uncertainty, the same loneliness. She had to live with it now, the way I had day after day, night after night. And that was the justice I had waited for since I was 8 years old. She tried reaching out after the divorce was finalized, as if the sudden emptiness around her finally forced her to remember the child she had abandoned. I got letters in my mailbox, short, panicked messages scribbled in her handwriting. We should talk. You're still my daughter. Please don't do this to me. Each one went unopened into the same shoebox where I kept the rabbit, the juice box straw wrapper, and the police report. I didn't need her words anymore, not when they came decades too late. The truth was simple. I had grown up without her, built a life without her, survived without her. She was the one who couldn't survive without me now. One evening, I passed her house just to see what had become of it. The driveway was empty, the curtains drawn, the perfect home hollowed out. Neighbors whispered about how quickly everything had fallen apart. The husband gone, the children choosing to live with him, the charities cutting ties. She had been left alone, the same way she had once left me. And I felt no triumph in that. Only a strange calm, like the world had finally balanced itself. When I got back to my apartment, I opened the shoebox and touched the rabbit for the first time in years. Its fur was matted, one eye missing, the stuffing pushing out of its seams. But instead of pain, I felt gratitude. That rabbit had been my witness, my proof that the little girl abandoned at the airport had survived. I placed it back carefully, closed the box, and slid it under my bed. That chapter was finished. I wasn't her daughter anymore. I was my own person, and I had made sure she would never forget the choice she made. For the first time, I could breathe without waiting for the sound of footsteps walking away. And for the first time, I realized revenge hadn't just been about her. It had been about reclaiming myself. Years later, I learned through whispers and fragments of gossip what became of her. She moved into a small rental on the edge of town, no longer the elegant woman in tailored coats and diamond jewelry, but someone who blended into the background, hunched over in thrift store cardigans. She worked part-time at a local store, the kind of place no one paid attention to, and I imagined her flinching every time a customer's face looked too closely at hers, wondering if they knew. Her sons rarely visited, her ex-husband remarried, and the name she had polished for so long carried no weight anymore. She had become invisible by her own choices, a ghost walking through the life she once thought was untouchable. For me, life moved forward in ways I never thought possible. I went back to school, studied hard, and built a career that no one had handed me. I created friendships that weren't born of blood, but of loyalty and love. People who saw me not as the abandoned girl with a backpack, but as someone worth standing beside. I built a home that felt safe, even if it was small, and for the first time, safety wasn't something I borrowed. It was something I owned. Sometimes, when I passed airports, the smell of coffee and the echo of rolling suitcases pulled me back for a heartbeat. I would picture that 8-year-old girl sitting on a bench, swinging her feet above the floor, waiting for a mother who would never return. But now, instead of feeling crushed by the memory, I would whisper to her in my mind, "We made it. She can't hurt us anymore." I never sought her out again. I didn't need another confrontation, another chance for her to speak excuses into the air. She already knew the truth, and I already had my closure. The silence between us remained. But now it was mine, not hers. I had taken back what she stole, the ability to choose who I was and who I would become. And that, more than anything I ever left on her doorstep, was the real revenge. There came a day when I heard she had fallen ill. Someone from the old neighborhood mentioned it in passing, their tone caught between pity and gossip. And for a moment, I froze, waiting for the familiar ache to return. But it didn't. The truth was, I felt nothing. I didn't rush to her bedside. I didn't send flowers or notes. I didn't even ask what the illness was. She had chosen decades ago that I was no longer her child, and I wasn't going to undo a lifetime of abandonment just because her body was failing. Still, late at night, I found myself wondering if she thought of me as she lay there, if the silence I had wrapped her in echoed louder in the hospital than any machine beeping at her side. Did she picture the rabbit? The juice box? The bench? At the airport? Or did she still tell herself the lie that walking away had been necessary, that it hadn't been as cruel as it was? I never found out. The next time her name came to me, it was in the form of an obituary buried at the back of the local paper. A handful of sentences summing up a life she had fought so hard to make appear perfect. It listed her charities, her loving family, the accomplishments she had chased to cover the hollow center. But nowhere in those lines was my name. She had managed to erase me even in death. For a moment, the old wound throbbed again, but then I realized something that made me breathe easier. Her obituary might have erased me, but my life had not. I was still here, stronger than the silence she left me with, and I carried a story she could never rewrite. I didn't go to the funeral. Instead, I walked through an airport, not to leave but to arrive, to claim the place that had once been my ending as my beginning. I sat at a bench, pulled the rabbit from my bag one last time, and smiled at the child I had been. I whispered, "We're free now," before tucking it into the trash can, not out of anger, but because I no longer needed proof of survival. I had become the proof. And as the sound of announcements echoed overhead, I stood and walked forward, not waiting for anyone to return, but ready for whatever came next. In the months after her death, I expected some part of me to feel hollow, like unfinished business lingering in the corners of my life. But instead, what settled in was a quiet strength, the kind that comes when you finally stop fighting ghosts. For so long, my existence had been a reaction to her choice, to leave, to erase, to pretend. Every step I took, every shadow I cast, carried her absence like a weight on my shoulders. But with her gone, the weight lifted. I realized I didn't need her acknowledgement, her apology, or her presence to validate who I had become. I had already built myself without her, and now nothing tethered me to the story she had written. I began sharing parts of my past with people I trusted, not as a wound to reopen, but as a testament to survival. When I told them about the airport, about the rabbit and the silence, I saw something in their eyes I had never seen in hers: compassion, outrage, belief. They didn't look at me as broken. They looked at me as someone who had walked through fire and come out carrying her own light. And with each telling, the memory transformed. It was no longer the moment I was abandoned. It was the moment I began. There were still nights when I dreamed of her, standing with her back turned, walking away into the crowd of strangers. But instead of waking with panic, I woke with clarity. She could keep walking forever in those dreams, because I wasn't chasing her anymore. I was moving forward, faster, stronger, with people beside me who would never let go of my hand in an airport or anywhere else. That was the life I had created, and that was the revenge she could never undo. I had turned her silence into my voice, her abandonment into my freedom, and her absence into my strength. Years passed, and I stopped, measuring time by how long it had been since that day in the airport. I built milestones of my own: graduations, birthdays I celebrated with chosen family, jobs I earned with sweat and determination. And with each one, I realized I had rewritten the story she tried to give me. Instead of being the abandoned child, I became the woman who refused to disappear. Sometimes I'd walk past mothers with their children in grocery stores or watch them at school events, and I'd feel a pang, not of envy anymore, but of understanding. I knew exactly how fragile that bond was, how devastating its absence could be. It made me kinder in ways she never was, softer with people who carried invisible scars. I never changed my last name, even though I could have. Part of me wanted the world to see the connection, not to honor her, but to remind myself that blood wasn't the only thing that defined me. I carried her name but filled it with my own meaning, my own story. And that was more powerful than erasing it. When I looked at the life I had built, I saw a kind of poetic symmetry. She had abandoned me thinking she could walk away clean, but her absence became the very force that shaped me into someone stronger than she could ever imagine. She had tried to erase me, but instead I was the proof she could never scrub from: existence. And so when people ask me about my past, I don't flinch anymore. I tell them, my mother left me at an airport when I was 8 years old. She thought she ended my story that day. But really, she started it. And I mean every word. Because the greatest revenge I ever found wasn't in the fear I left her with, or the cracks I carved into her perfect life. It was in the fact that I lived, I thrived, and I became everything she could never stop me from being. There came a moment, years later, when I found myself back in an airport, not by accident, but by choice. I had booked a ticket for a trip I could finally afford, a vacation that wasn't about escaping, but about exploring. As I rolled my suitcase, across the polished floor, I caught the faint smell of coffee and heard the familiar echo of announcements overhead. And for a second, I was that 8-year-old girl again, clutching her rabbit and waiting on a bench. But then I looked down at my own hands, steady and sure, and realized how far I'd come. I wasn't abandoned this time. I wasn't waiting. I was moving forward, carrying everything I had built for myself. I sat near a window overlooking the plains, and instead of sadness, I felt gratitude. For the people I had chosen as family, for the strength I had forged in silence, for the life that was mine alone. I thought about how she had spent her last years unraveling, while I had spent mine stitching myself back together. And it hit me that this was the ending I had earned. Not her acknowledgement, not her apology, but my freedom. She would always be the woman who left me behind. I would always be the girl who survived it. But now, I was also the woman who rose above it. When my flight was called, I stood up and walked toward the gate, the same kind of gate where my childhood had ended. Only this time I wasn't afraid. I wasn't looking back, searching for a hand that would never return. I was looking ahead with a heart that finally knew the truth. I was never the one who was lost. She was. And I had already left her behind for good. On that trip, sitting on the plane as it lifted off the ground, I felt something I hadn't known since before the airport all those years ago. Lightness. Not just the physical sensation of rising through clouds, but the emotional weight finally slipping from my shoulders. I had spent so long building strength out of pain that I forgot what it felt like to simply exist without carrying her shadow. Somewhere over the ocean, I let myself imagine what my life would have been like if she had stayed. Maybe I would have grown up softer. Maybe I wouldn't have known the sting of betrayal so early. But then I realized I wouldn't be me. The resilience, the independence, the fire in my chest that had kept me alive through every storm, that was mine because of what she had done, not despite it. And for the first time, I didn't hate that truth. I started journaling on that trip, pouring out every memory, every detail of that day and all the years that followed, not to relive it, but to release it. I wrote about the rabbit, about the woman in the navy blazer at the airport, about the cracked mattress in the foster home and the envelope I left on her table years later. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the words felt like they no longer belonged, locked inside me. When I finished, I realized the story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a reminder for anyone who had ever been left behind that survival could become strength, that abandonment didn't have to mean erasure. When I came home, I tucked that journal on my shelf beside the shoebox I once kept under my bed. The rabbit, the juice box wrapper, the police report, they were relics of a past that had shaped me. But the journal was different. It was my choice, my voice, my version of the truth. And with that, I finally felt what revenge had always promised, but never fully delivered. Peace. Because the greatest victory wasn't that she lost everything. It was that I had found myself. In the years that followed, I found myself telling the story less and less. Not because I was ashamed, but because I no longer needed to. The people closest to me already knew, and new people in my life didn't need to meet me through my scars. I was no longer the girl waiting on a bench or the woman dropping reminders into her mother's polished world. I was simply me, whole, steady, and finally free. Sometimes when I cleaned my apartment, I'd stumble across the shoebox and wonder if it was time to throw it away. But I never did. Not out of bitterness, but because it reminded me of how far I had come. That rabbit wasn't a wound anymore. It was proof of survival. Once, on a quiet Sunday morning, I saw a little girl at the park chasing after a kite, her mother running right behind her, laughing as the string tangled around their hands. For a moment, I froze, the echo of my own childhood tugging at me. But instead of envy or grief, I felt a soft smile spread across my face. That little girl would never know what it meant to be left behind, and I was glad for her. And I realized something then. My revenge was complete. Not because my mother had fallen, but because I had risen. I had built a life so full, so solid, that her absence no longer defined me. The story that had begun with an airport bench was finally reaching its end. I no longer needed her shadow to remind me of who I was. I had written my own chapters, and they were louder, brighter, and stronger than anything she could have imagined. And though a part of me would always carry that 8-year-old girl inside, she wasn't waiting anymore. She was walking forward, hand in hand with the woman she had grown into. One last time, I returned to that airport, not because I had to, but because I wanted to stand in the place where my story had cracked open. I found the same terminal, though. The benches were newer, the paint fresher, and the voices around me belonged to a different generation of travelers. I sat down, placed my hands in my lap, and let myself feel the hum of the space. For a moment, I could almost see her walking away again, heels clicking, coat swaying, my 8-year-old self frozen in disbelief. But instead of pain, I felt compassion for that child. She hadn't deserved what happened, but she had endured it. And I, the woman sitting here now, was living proof that she had made it through. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. I stood, walked toward the exit, and when the glass door slid open to the noise of traffic and sunlight outside, I felt no pull to look back. The airport wasn't a scar anymore. It was simply a place, no different from any other. My life no longer orbited around that day. It had become only a beginning, not the defining end. As I left, I thought about my mother, wherever her memory now lay. And I realized the deepest truth of all. She had abandoned me to erase me, but she had failed. because every step I took beyond that bench was a step she could never undo. And in that, I had won. My story was mine, and hers was finished.